Hi, I'm Mike from 1A Auto. We've been selling auto parts for over 30 years.
We're going to pull the hubcap off. We're going to use a pry bar. You can try to grab it with your fingers and pull. It's a little tricky. Grab a pry bar or a straight blade screwdriver. Get in behind here and just pry it out. Pull it off. Next we'll take a 21mm socket and a breaker bar. We're going to crack the lug nuts free before we raise the vehicle. There we go. Now we're going to raise and support the vehicle. We're using a 2-post lift. You can use the jack and jack stands. Before we take this wheel off, we want to take this nut off. To get that off, I got to take this cotter pin out. I'm going to use some straight cutters. I'm just going to bend this back like this. And then I can use a cotter pin tool or a pick. Pull it out. Pull that out. We're gonna replace this. Don't ever reuse a cotter pin. And spray a little rust penetrant on here. Let it soak for a little bit. All right, so I load the car back down to the ground just so the tire is touching the ground. And I'm gonna use a 30mm socket. Take this nut off with a breaker bar. All right, now it's getting loose. Now I'm gonna lift the vehicle. I'll take a ratchet, take this nut off. And there it is. Now I'll take these lug nuts off. Pull the tire off. We're going to be pulling this caliper off, and the reason why we're going to be taking apart the caliper and then the bracket is we're replacing the brakes anyway. If you're not replacing the brakes, you could just take these 2 bolts out of the caliper bracket and then take the caliper and the bracket and set it aside. I'm going to use a 14mm wrench. I'm going to take these 2 caliper bolts out. Take that one out. You can take the top one out. All right, so I'm going to compress the caliper a little bit. I'm just going to use a screwdriver, get it between the rotor and the caliper and just pry it in a little bit. That's just going to push some of the fluid back so that it can slide off the caliper easily. Then I'm going to take a bungee cord and I'm going to slide it through the spring right here, and I'm going to loop it into the caliper holes, and that'll hang on the side so we don't put any stress on the brake hose. Next, we're going to take these spring retainers out. These kind of push the pads out from the rotor. Just pull them up, set them aside because we're going to reuse them. Pull those out. Next, we can pull the pads off. Just slide it out, and then slide the outside one out. The inboard one has a squealer on it on the top side. Outboard one does not. Next, I'm going to take a 17mm socket and a breaker bar. I'm going to take these two caliper bolts off. These generally are on pretty tight, so. Then I'm going to use a 17mm socket and a ratchet once those are broken free. Pull that bolt out, and pull this bottom one out. And we can pull the bracket off. I'm going to remove this rotor. If you grab it and it pulls right off, that's good. This one's on there a little bit harder, so I'm going to take a hammer and just hammer it right in those locations. Now that it's loose, you can pull the rotor off. I'm going to use some rust penetrant on this nut and bolt right here for the ball joint. And I'm going to loosen it up. All right, so we got that ball joint bolt out, and we're going to separate the ball joint from the knuckle. I'm going to use a fork. You can use other methods to get this ball joint out, but this is what we're going to do. And just hit it with a hammer. Separate it. Sometimes they come out harder than that. This one came out pretty easy. Take a pry bar and just pry it down a little bit. As I pry down with a pry bar, I'm going to hit on the control arm. Get the ball joint out of the way. You want to make sure you don't put your fingers anywhere near the ball joint, in between the ball joint and the knuckle, or they'll get squished. Set that aside. All right, I'm going to move this brake caliper to this side so it's out of my way. Next, I'm going to take this ABS sensor out. Back here, there's a wire right here. There's a retainer that's on the back side of the strut. So remove this from the strut. And then over here, there's a 10mm bolt that I'm going to be taking off. I'm going to use a 10mm socket, an extension, and a ratchet. Take this 10mm bolt off for the wheel speed sensor. Pull that bolt out. I'm going to use some needle nose pliers, and I'm going to try to get this sensor out. It's rusted in there a little bit. I'm just trying to twist it back and forth, see if I can get it out. if you do break it when doing this, you will need to replace the sensor. I'll just wiggle it with my hand. And pull it right out. Before we put it back in, we'll just clean it up a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit of rust penetrant on this outer tie rod nut up top here. Also going to put some on these two nuts on the front strut. Now I'm going to use a 14mm socket and a ratchet. I'm going to take this outer tie rod end nut off. Pull that nut off. All right, now I'm going to hit the top of the tie rod end to get it through. Pull that out. Now we can take these two nuts off. I'm going to loosen up these two nuts. I'm going to use a 21mm wrench to hold the bolt from spinning. Then you use a 21mm socket and a breaker bar. We'll loosen these nuts up. Do the same with the bottom one. Once we loosen them, we can switch to a ratchet. All right, those are loose. Now I'll switch to a ratchet with a 21mm socket. Take the nuts off. I'll take that nut off. And now I'll take the other one off. Take that nut off. Now I'm going to want to support the knuckle underneath. Make sure the ball joint's not in the way. And then I'm going to take a hammer and I'm going to knock these two bolts out while holding on to the knuckle. And then I'll take the bolt out and I can pull the knuckle straight out. So we set our knuckle up in the vise and we're going to press out the hub part of the assembly, and we'll start doing that now. As you can see, as it's pushing down, the hub part is coming out. Once it comes out, it's probably not going to go past this part, so I don't have to catch it. All right, so we got the hub off. Part of the bearing got stuck to the hub, which sometimes happens, so we're gonna have to remove that from the hub. But for now, I'm gonna try to pull the bearing out of the knuckle. So I'm gonna need a straight head screwdriver. We're gonna pull this snap ring off right here, get in under here or under here. Just pry it up a little bit. And pull that out. This is pretty rusty, so I'm going to spray some rust penetrant. All right, so we'll spray some rust penetrant, let that sit for a little bit. It'll help us press the bearing out. Now that we got that snap ring out, we are going to press the bearing out. And there it is. That's the old bearing. So we're going to try to remove this bearing race that came off from the bearing when we were taking the hub off. So we'll use this adapter right here and then put it back in the press. Just snug these nuts up. And try to press it out. There we go. Got it off. There's the old race. There's the hub. Before we install the bearing back in, we're going to use a wire brush. You could use some sandpaper or some emery cloth. Clean up some of the rust in here. Definitely going to want to get some of the junk out of the groove, some of the rust and debris, so the snap ring can go back in properly. And then down at the bottom, you want to make sure it bottoms out properly as well. So we'll clean up a little bit of that rust. Here's our old bearing. Here's our new bearing from 1aauto.com. As you can see, the size is the same, shape's the same. The ABS ring is on this side. Get yours at 1aauto.com and you'll be ready to rock and roll. So we pulled our bearing out of the freezer. So it's pretty cold, so that's going to help install it. You're going to want to make sure that the ABS ring goes down into the knuckle. So we'll slide that right there. I'm going to press it in. You want to make sure it doesn't go in crooked. If it starts going in a little crooked, you can loosen it up and adjust. That's as far as it'll go. So that's in there. And then the other side, the ABS ring is on the inside. We're going to reinstall this retainer ring or snap ring. It's a good idea to replace this if you have access to one. We're just going to reuse our old one. And it's snapped right in. And make sure it's in, just take a screwdriver and a hammer and tap it in all the way around. That's good. Now we're going to reinstall the hub. We're going to go over to the press and press it in. Just get it lined up there. You want this to go in straight as well. All right, that's all the way in. Now our hub and bearing are in, and we can reinstall this on the car. So before I install this knuckle, I want to clean where this ball joint would go. You take a little bit of emery cloth, get in there, clean that out, or a wire brush. Just clean this out. That'll just make it easier to install. All right, so we're going to take the knuckle with the new bearing and hub. We're going to slide it on the axle. Get it lined up. With that lined up, we're going to pull down on the control arm. You're going to want to line the ball joint up. Get that on. And then we can line it up with the front strut. Right there. So pull this down a little bit, get the bolts in for the strut. Those in. Get this bolt on for the lower ball joint. I'm going to put the nuts on for the strut. You're going to tighten these nuts down on the strut. I'll use a 21mm wrench to hold the bolt on the back side, and then a 21mm socket and a ratchet to tighten down the nuts, and then we'll torque them after. Now I'm going to torque it with a torque wrench and the same 21mm socket. I'm going to torque these to 120 foot-pounds. I'm using it with this torque wrench we actually sell from 1aauto.com. We'll torque the upper one. If you're having trouble torquing this, you can install the tie rod first, and then it won't move as much, and then it'll be easier to torque it. Next, I'm going to install this tie rod nut. Line the tie rod up. Get that started. All right. Next, I'm going to use a pry bar to pry up underneath the tie rod end. That's going to hold the stud from spinning. And I'm going to use a 14mm socket and a ratchet. Tighten this down. Next, I'm going to use a torque wrench, and I'm going to torque this to 29 foot-pounds. Next, we'll install this pinch bolt that goes to hold the ball joints in. You might have to move the control arm a little bit to get it in there. All right, you got it started, and I'll just tap it in a little bit with a hammer. Install the nut. All right, so I'm going to snug this up. I'm going to use a 14mm wrench on the bolt side, then a 14mm socket on a ratchet, and I'll tighten this up. Now we're going to torque this to 28 foot-pounds. We're going to install this axle nut. I'll use a 30mm socket to tighten it down. Just do it by hand first. Now that it's snug, I'm going to torque it. I'm going to use a long pry bar to keep the hub from spinning. I'm going to hold it right there, and then I'm going to use the axle nut and a torque wrench, and I'm going to torque this to 180 foot-pounds. You can also put the tire on and torque it just like we took the bolt off, took the nut off. Next we're going to install the cotter pin. You want to replace it with a new cotter pin. And I'll take some side cutters. I'm going to fold this over just like that. You can cut off the excess. And then I can either fold this over on the back or just cut it right here. I'll just cut it here. That's all set. Next we're going to install the ABS sensor in this bracket on the back of the front strut. And then the ABS sensor, we'll slide it into the knuckle. Next I'll install the 10mm bolt. Next I'll take a 10mm socket, extension, and a ratchet. We'll just snug this up. Remember, it is plastic, so not too tight, just snug. Now we're going to install the rotor. Install the caliper bracket. Just slide it over and put the caliper bracket bolts back in. Get those started. I'm going to use a 17mm socket and a ratchet. We'll just snug these up before I torque them. Now we're going to use a torque wrench and torque these to 62 foot-pounds. Now we're going to install these brake pads. The one with the squealer goes on the inside, and the squealer is going to go up. And the other one without the squealer goes on the outside. Now we're going to take these pad return springs. I'm going to slide this into the hole on the pads, and then that one as well. We'll do the same with the bottom one. Slide that in there, and that right there, just like that. Now we're going to remove the bungee cord holding our caliper up. Pull that out from the spring. We can take this old brake pad, and we're going to use this caliper compressor tool we got from 1aauto.com. We'll line this up. Now it's a good idea to check the brake fluid level before you compress this. If the brake fluid level is at the top, you're going to want to adjust it, take some out a little bit before you compress this. If it's about halfway, then you're good. And then we're going to compress this, and slowly brake fluid is going to go through the lines, back up to the master cylinder, and back into the reservoir. Now once that piston is compressed into the caliper, we're going to slide that back onto the brake caliper bracket. And install these caliper bolts. Next, we're going to tighten these up with a 14mm socket and a torque wrench, and we're going to torque these to 20 foot-pounds. Do that. Now we're going to put the tire and wheel on, line it up with the lugs, and put the nuts on. Now I'm going to torque these using a 21mm socket and a torque wrench to 84 foot-pounds, and I'm going to torque it in a star pattern or a cross pattern so that the wheel gets tightened down evenly. Next, we're going to install the hubcap. You want to line this little groove up with the valve stem so it's in the right position. Just sometimes it's a little bit tricky. Just give it a little tap. Could use a rubber mallet if you need to. Get that back on.
Thanks for watching. Visit us at oneauto.com for quality auto parts, fast and free shipping, and the best customer service in the industry.